She is a lifelong Detroiter, community activist, an organizer, a youth violence prevention advocate, and gun violence victim survivor. She specializes in various leadership roles, such as trainer and facilitator in conflict and dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution, restorative justice, and victim offender reconciliation dialogues on campus and in the community. She serves as the community dispute resolution specialist and faculty instructor for the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies program here at Wayne. And she teaches a special topics class called Social Justice Activism at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. She also serves as the program director for the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, a program at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies here at Wayne that delivers expertise training in higher learning academic settings. Such programs provide high school youth development services that focus on civil engagement, conflict resolution, intervention, violence prevention, bullying, diversity, civil rights, race relations, negotiation, leadership, international affairs, diplomacy, social justice, and crucial life skills with the overarching goal to teach students to individually and collectively foster peace within their schools and communities. So she's doing a lot of important work in the schools that here in Detroit. She holds a BA degree in mass communication from Rochester College, an MA in dispute resolution from Wayne State University, and a graduate certificate in peace and security studies from Wayne State University. And today she'll be making her debut performance in our Brown Bag series. She says she's nervous, but I know she's very confident. And her topic is social justice activism, theoretical frameworks, subsets of conflicts, implications, and opportunities. So please welcome to the podium Professor Barbara Jones. Clap her up, as they say in church.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I should have given you the Cliff Notes version of that bio. I thought you might have edited it down, but that's okay. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. I see more people than I could actually hear. You all here? You got coffee, so can I get this one more time? Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you for coming. I would like to thank all of you. I have a couple of students here, mentors, friends, and then I have new friends here. So as Dr. Edwards says, yes, this is my, I'm an infant in giving a brown bag lecture today. I do talk all the time, but you guys wouldn't really believe that I am very, very shy as much as I talk. Public speaking has always been a challenge for me. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to start off based off of this talk. Like Dr. Edwards said, I teach social justice activism. I teach this course online, and social justice activism and social movements, you know, it's so many dynamics, very complex, so many social movements and so many ways that we can participate in social justice activism. I can't possibly get it all in 16 weeks, but I do my best. Historically, geographically, environmentally, we've been involved in social movements for a very, very, very long time. So I'm going to have this discussion probably with the director for the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies and just see how we can expand, you know, maybe beginning intermediate and advanced. So I want to read this quote to you all. Let's see if the clicker's working. Oh, we probably have to turn it on.
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, let me test.
We need activism to redo this room.
We can organize and mobilize to talk about that. So they're animated.
Okay.
That's
Oh, it seems to be working.
Is now it's work, okay. Is it
That's how-
Bluetooth or is
It's USB.
Oh, okay, okay. Thank you all for your patience. So I'm going to read this quote to you. Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, awe-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this, or it does nothing. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical. But it is a struggle, and power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out that the exact measure of injustice and wrong with which be imposed upon them, and these will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows, or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Frederick Douglass gave this speech at the West India Emancipation event, August 3rd, 1957, in New York. So, what is a social movement? Can anyone kind of give the Cliff Notes version of what a social movement is? Well, my Cliff Note version is social movements can and are to be thought of as informal, yet or organized, yet informal entities that are engaged in extra-institutional conflict that is oriented towards a goal. Social movements are networks of informal influence between a multitude of individuals, groups, or associations that really engage in political or cultural conflict on the basis of collective identity, collective action, and collective behaviors. Now, social movements and social justice activism, they help create and rebuild identities as well. Since social movements focus on redistributing rights and social justice activism, these, in most cases, they do benefit society, even when we are in conflict. So, what is produced when people demand inclusion? What is produced when people demand justice? What is produced when people organize? What is produced when people mobilize? Social movements references collective activities. That's pretty much the basis and the definition of collective action. And its objective is to bring about or resist predominant changes in a society or group. So blending all of these elements together, we can define a social movement as purposeful, organized, collective behavior that are informal entities that are engaged in extra-institutional conflict. These goals can be either aimed at specific and narrow goals or aimed at cultural change or reform. A social movement is not a political party or an interest group, although it has political ramifications or political influences. It's no political power, and social movements do not serve the elite. It's not a trend. But some argue that it's not a fad either. Some argue that it is a fad. Fads usually come and go. And some social movements or social justice activism, they go through stages as well. And we're going to talk about that. But a social movement is not a ritual. So the theoretical frameworks of social justice and social justice activism and social movements are collective action, collective identity, collective behavior, master frames, resource mobilization, stages of movements. There are more definitions from these theories. I just don't have enough time in this hour to give all of those theoretical frameworks. So, by show of hands, how many of you all participate in social justice movements or are activists, organizers, and mobilizers? By show of hands. Don't be shy and raise those hands high.
It depends how you define it.
So can you all raise your hands again? Okay. Maybe a little bit more than half in this room. How many of you are, and this is for another lecture, maybe if you invite me back again, I can talk about free riders. How many of you can say you may be free riders of social movements?
Free riders?
Free riders.
What are those?
Free riders are people who benefit
Okay.
from those who are activists, organizers, movement builders, that benefit from all of the struggles and the protests and the marches and the demonstrations and the phone calls and all of the activism. One example of a free rider is participating in a union. How many of us participate in unions or are members of a union? Okay. So we pay membership to be a part of the union. Some faculty don't pay to be a part of the union. They don't pay their dues. And the ones that don't pay their dues, they're considered free riders because they are benefiting off of all of the, how should I say, I want to be very mindful in how I say this. They are benefiting without paying of all of the things that activists and organizers do that are involved in the labor union. Right now, I'm presently in negotiations. We are in negotiations. I'm a part of Local 477, UPTF, which is Union Part-Time Faculty, and we are in negotiations right now for better pay, more support. We can't get our members to come to a general membership meeting. They don't respond to emails. The only time that they respond is when their class is canceled. Which is not a bad thing. They should respond, but they're still benefiting off of the free rider aspect. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about types of social movements. Some of you are, a couple of my students are here from my current class. Some of you have probably seen these terms already, but because we don't have this face-to-face interaction, and I have a former student of my class, we've discussed this online in our discussion board forum threads. So types of movements. This model was developed by Dr. David Aberle, who's a cultural anthropologist, and he came up with these specific types of social movements: alternative social movement, redemptive social movement, reformative social movement, and a revolutionary social movement. They are all distinctive in what they aim to do, who they target. So let's talk about what an alternative social movement is. So an alternative social movement pretty much seeks to change some aspects of an individual's behavior. So you see this photo here, texting and driving. It can wait. A couple of other examples of an alternative social movement is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Another example of an alternative social movement would be gun violence. Students Demand Action. They have a student organization right here on campus. A redemptive social movement. So a redemptive social movement seeks to really transform the person, personal transformation, individuals. It does fall back on collective action and collective identity, but it takes that personal transformation and is typically religious in nature. And this photo is one from the Civil Rights Movement. Various interfaith organizations and churches mobilized during the Civil Rights Movement. As you can see, one of the protest signs, we march together, Catholics, Jews, Protestants, for dignity and brotherhood of all men under God. Reformative social movements. They seek to change only some specific aspect of how society functions. So, an example of a reformative social movement, there are many examples, but I chose these two. Same-sex marriage equality, LGBTQ rights, interracial marriage, and you all are familiar with the Loving story. I don't want to assume, but that's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Richard and Mildred Loving, how they both went to jail, but they actually had to live apart in Virginia because of the laws against interracial marriage. And they won their right to wed in 1967 through a Supreme Court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. That's a reformative social movement. Revolutionary. We use this term a lot, revolutionary, but there is a definition as it relates to social movements and what it means. So, a revolutionary social movement seeks to overthrow the existing social system and replace it with a greatly different one, a fair and a just one. So revolutionary movements, they want to root all of this injustices out of the system. And a revolutionary movement, it really flourishes when reform is blocked so that the revolution can remain as far as the people are concerned. When we talk about revolutionary, when we talk about revolutionist, that's what that can be attributed to when we talk about revolutionary social movements. Also, something that's really important, and I also want to underscore that it really addresses the conditions, the real root, deep-seated conditions of injustice, such as police brutality. That's just one. A lot of misery, a lot of violence inflicted upon society. The revolutionary movement arises because people are so dissatisfied with slow change. And when we talk about this type of revolutionary movement, how long, and I consider myself a baby in the room, although I'm the last year of a baby boomer, but how long have we been dealing with issues of police brutality? A very, very long time. Since before I was born, and I was born in 1964. So I was able to pull some data from this organization called the Crowd Counting Consortium Preliminary. Well, this is a preliminary research and data set that lists over 8,700 protests in the United States in 2017. This particular one, they counted every day from the Women's March on January 21st, 2017 until or through December 31st. 87 protests. About 74 of these protests were either directed against Trump administration policies on issues that conflicted with the president's viewpoint. And we talked about police shootings just a minute ago. Particularly police shootings of black people. Overall, the consortium estimates that between 5.9 million and 9 million people protested in the United States in 2017. That's roughly almost 3% of the population. Those are huge numbers. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to try to clarify something in your treatment of social movements.
Mm-hmm.
Would the people marching at Charlottesville with tiki torches or the Right to Life movement be qualified under your definition of social movement?
Absolutely, but they will be classified as a category of hate crimes. But nevertheless, they are a movement.
Well, Right to Life wouldn't be classified as hate crime.
Well, we're talking, I'm speaking specifically with
Although they might in
Charlottesville.
if violence exists, like bombing at reproductive centers.
Mhm, mhm.
But, so you do, that is inclusive of different perspectives politically.
Absolutely, absolutely. Here.
Just to also clarify, so are you saying that this type of movement, what's on the screen right now, is considered a revolutionary movement?
No, I'm not associating this data with any particular type
Okay.
of movement that we went over. This data just shows how many people in the United States, based off of 2017, that participated in protest. But it's not. That photo, are you referring to this photo in particular? No, that's just a photo showing protest, not related to this data.
So what would you consider a revolutionary movement then?
Well, we kind of talked about it. I can go back to that slide. I mean, there's several of them, but I gave 2 examples. Black Lives Matter, the Civil Rights Movement, March for Our Lives. And those are historical and emerging social movements. We can go back, historically. We can go back to the protests, protesting the Vietnam War.
Those seem like reformist movements rather than revolutionary. You think of revolution, you think of the Cuban Revolution overthrew a whole system, the Russian Revolution. We use revolutions when you overthrow a whole system instead of a new one.
Whether
Where's-
underground.
Whether underground or they tried,
And that's one thing that I was kind of saying, the way we use revolutionary and how you categorize, whether it's a revolutionary movement or not, you have to look at every aspect of that injustice, historically to not. Some of them contradict, we talked about this in class. Some contradict being a reform movement as a revolutionary movement. It all depends on who's really ticking these boxes or how we have these conversations and the context. Some of them do take a revolutionary mold, but they may be a reform movement. So, again, these things are, it's not linear at all. They're complex, they're complicated, but it takes conversation for us to break this down. I'm not per se the historian here, but history informs as well. And then we have to look at the emerging social movements that are taking place in our country. So based off of this data, we estimate that 89% of these people were protesting Trump or his agenda. I just wanted to show how many people participate in social justice activism, social movements, and it does not always have to manifest itself into a rally or march. It could be a letter writing campaign. It can be delivering food to the homeless shelter. It takes many forms. About 74 of those protests were either directly against Trump. Okay, that one we already went. Oh, I'm going backwards. I'm sorry. Let me move forward. Okay, so let's talk about Herbert Blumer. Aren't you all excited to know who Herbert Blumer is? So Herbert Blumer, sociologist, developed 4 stages of social movements. And Blumer believed in symbolic interactionism as far as how he did his research and how he studied people. And he stated that believing that individuals create social reality through collective and individual action, and he emphasized these ongoing themes as relates to how these social realities, as it relates to justice and injustice, is a continuous process. And as we develop continuous processes, we have to look at the generational aspect. We have to look at the cultural aspect as well. So let's talk about stage 1. The emergence of a social movement. That's the first stage of the social movement life cycle. It's when people become aware of a problem, really take notice of the problem, and really come together with other people collectively and share those same feelings or emotions and emotions. Now this stage is really about grievances, it's really about issues. Participants are really discontent with some type of policy or injustice that they may be facing, but they have not taken any steps as of yet to even deal with the injustice. It's more of building that collective action. Coalescence is the second stage. So this involves when groups reach out to other groups or individuals to increase membership in activism or a social movement. This coalescence, it really seeks to overcome barriers with many people that they've never been able to overcome before as it relates to social movements. That's what Blumer really studies, the symbolic interaction. And this happens when social unrest or discontent passes without any organizing or mobilizing. So this is a real popular stage. You know, everyone wants to get involved in the issue when it first comes out. Everybody's gung-ho. I want to sign up, I want to join, I'm going to attend a meeting. This is a critical stage. But it's no longer just a general sense of discontent. It's really about identifying who and what is responsible, and that can take many forms as it relates to the injustice. Discontent is no longer uncoordinated by the individual. They're coalescing as a group and as a collective. The next stage. Bureaucratization. This is the third stage when the movement becomes a political force. And it's defined by Bloomer pretty much as a formalization. We did say in the beginning that social movements are informal networks, but when it comes to the political aspect, these pretty much are formal entities, people, platforms, organizing, coalition building, and strategies take place during this cycle. And it's really a coordinated strategy that has to happen across the SMO. And when I say the word SMO, that is a term that means social movement organization. And decline. Decline is the final stage of a movement when the organization finally completes its goal, its mission, or it's just totally dismissed or fizzes out as being irrelevant. Can anyone name a movement or just give an example of a social movement that just kind of disappeared? It just fizzled out, you didn't hear any more about? Any examples? What's your name, sir?
John.
John.
Yeah.
John and Sarah.
Okay. I'm thinking of the anti-slavery law in the late 19th century when slavery was officially ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. It's declined. It was the end of slavery. Now, other problems emerged later, but officially slavery was over.
Okay. Okay. We're going to talk about that in a second. Thank you. Sarah?
Two of them we talked about in class. One was Occupy Wall Street, and then the other one is the Black Panther movement. You don't really hear about them.
Yeah. Yeah. Black Panther movement. We could talk about that because, you know, we have I know some former Black Panther activists who are still active as well. They
But
may
are they a
not.
movement? But are these remnants, are these individuals a movement? Are they still a movement?
They are movement building, they're mobilizing, they're organizing, they're not doing it on an individual level.
Yeah,
It
but in
could come
terms
under
of,
the,
like, media coverage, you don't hear about them.
yeah, not the Black Panther Party, but did you hear of the new Black Panther Party?
We've heard of the movie.
We heard of the movie, but not the organization, the new Black Panther Party. Okay, that emerged from the original Black Panthers.
What about the civil rights movement?
And the civil rights movement. We can, I don't think that the civil rights movement would, I don't know this because the civil rights movement did not really decline, it evolved, it spread out. There are subsets of the civil rights movement today. And I can kind of give a couple of examples. But the civil rights movement, the most prominent movement in history, is not irrelevant. It probably just merged, not just probably, it has taken on principles that you see in Black Lives Matter.
The civil rights movement became everybody's movement.
Yes,
The women, the
yes.
Latinos, disabled, everybody else built on that basic movement.
That is so correct, the interconnectedness. And we talk about this in class a lot, and I emphasize that all the time. We got two Kennedys in the room, because I had a Kennedy in my class, and Farrah, that the civil rights movement birthed other movements. So there are four ways.
And it morphed into voting rights issues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. William, I'm sorry, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I
I'm
think
sorry.
that another contribution of the civil rights movement is it also translated to political power in Black Americans, especially in the 70s. More blacks started to become governors and mayors. Jesse Jackson ran in the 80s and Shirley Chisholm in the 70s. So I think it translated to political power. That was like a main contribution of the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. And we had our first black president
For sure.
based from the civil rights movement.
And white women have been the main beneficiary of the civil rights movement.
Oh, absolutely, no doubt. No doubt. Now, do we say all women have been beneficiaries of the civil rights movement? That's debatable. I would say black women have been left behind as it relates to the women's movement related to the civil rights, but that's another conversation. There's disagreement and conflicts within the women's movement, and it has been for years. From the first stage of the women's movement to the second wave to the third wave to now. So the four ways in which social movements can decline is repression, control or destroy a social movement, cooptation. Movement leaders come to identify with authorities or movement targets more with they kind of coalesce with the social movement constituents. They go into dialogue. Success. Social movements end in defeat through repression or cooptation. Some decline based because they are successful. And failure. Failure of social movements due to the organizational or strategic failings. Resource mobilization, no money, no people, no organizing, no meetings, no campaigning. And not saying campaigning in a political sense. Promoting, creating awareness, education. So from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 in that order. So this is a photo, just one photo of the civil rights movement. And it is the best known of all social movements, both in theory and in action. It was one of the earliest and most dramatic movements, and William pointed it out. It was very politically crucial and important, and it had international influence. When I teach about the Arab Spring, we haven't really gotten to that, and I show protest photos relating to the Arab Spring. There are children holding up photos stating, "We shall overcome." Those words were birthed out of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is a paradigm model. And you were definitely right, Jose. It's informed and it's shaped the field of collective action, collective behavior, collective identities, and social movement theories on a whole. And it's so many theories that, I haven't even touched on. And we know that conflict between an interest in understanding the world and the spirit to change it is merely that what it is. It's a theory, and people are just comfortable with theories as well, and we have to move from that remoteness of just studying those theories to direct action.
Fred has a question.
And just to point out, the civil rights movement had its origins, of course, back in the Gandhi movements
Yes.
in India.
Yes, the SALT movement, India.
And
Gandhi,
before
yes.
that, some criticism, but in the South African Gandhi efforts on behalf of some groups in South Africa. So there's been a lot of forerunners in all cases.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, in all cases. And the conflicts within them. And, you know, that's why I kind of am excited, although it's frustrating for me when we study all of these conflicts and what is birthed out of these conflicts and the conflicts that continue to happen and emerge. But also we have to look at some of those conflicts are an agitation, or they can serve as being counterproductive to the movement, or it can be a tactic to throw the movement aside.
The lesson there might be that the most successful movements are those with leaders who really are aware of the methods used by their predecessors and make innovations and improvements and bring it all together.
Can you give an example of basically what you're saying?
I'm thinking of King, taking the lessons of Gandhi to a new level.
Oh, absolutely, and you know, King gives Gandhi so much credit as well. And when we talk about King, and this is probably a discussion, definitely not, you know, it needs to be a discussion, is that there are so many other civil rights icons outside of Martin Luther King. But Martin Luther King was chosen to be a part of the movement. He was chosen by others to lead because of his capabilities. Bayard Rustin, I consider him a father of the civil rights movement. The Pullman Porters, A. Philip Randolph, an icon.
Ralph Bunche.
Ralph Bunche as well. And you are right. Thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Pearson.
Do you
That's why we study
differentiate-
conflict.
You differentiate between, we've been talking really about nonviolent social movements. What about violent ones?
So, we are not going to really touch on violent social movements, but we may touch on it. And I want to kind of play a video as it relates to gun violence. That's pretty open, it's pretty wide, it's pretty broad. So maybe this will address your question, Jose. I just, an hour, if not enough time. I just wanted to give some nuggets, just some nuggets for all of us to walk away from. And I think this may answer your question. Oh no. So Kennedy. Okay. Okay. I forgot what you told me to do to play the video. I think that's my touch point.
Violence in America is the context for the project of justice reform. The entire problem of racial injustice is a problem of collective violence. We can think of justice reform as a peace movement.
Violence not only affects the way that we relate to each other, but it affects our brains. It affects the ways that we respond to and hear the people around us. Every part of our relationships, our communities are impacted by the damage that violence can do.
We start with the recognition that we, as a country, have been created through acts of violence, and that the criminal justice system has been an instrument of violence. Unlocking the puzzle of violence is central to the square one ambition of thinking about a different future.
I can hear my brother crying, I can't breathe. Now I'm in the struggle singing, I can't leave. We ain't gonna stop till our people are free.
I think the U.S. right now is struggling with many forms of violence. There is a rampant issue with gun violence that stretches across the country. We have issues related to domestic violence. We have sexual assaults. The unfortunate reality is, as rich and diverse as our country is, it is also richly diverse in the strengths of violence that we see.
In Detroit, we have seen this severe retraction of the state in terms of all of its positive public welfare functions. You cannot guarantee that the state is going to educate your child well, or that it's going to provide you clean water. This is structural violence, and we understand the relationship between that and interpersonal violence.
Hunger, housing instability, all of those things affect our neurobiological development in ways that increases the likelihood that when we bump into each other, we are going to respond with a fight.
There's an illusion of choice when there's no investment in education, there's no investment in opportunities for people. That leads people to do things they normally wouldn't do for survival.
The kids in my program have been to like 15 funerals by the time they're sophomores. They're learning more on the walk to school than they're learning in the school.
How easy was it for y'all to get a gun when y'all was in the streets? Can you get a gun before you get a bag of chips?
30,000 people die a year from suicide and homicides from gun violence, which is a national emergency. If you're gonna talk about violence, you can't have that discussion without gun violence.
The rates of violence that we have are not possible without the mechanical advantage afforded by government.
It's obvious that guns come from some other place besides poor communities. These things are manufactured elsewhere and brought into those communities with complete disregard about their lethal consequences. We're seeing some of our greatest declines in urban areas where young people are leading the charge in gun violence reduction.
We are at the forefront of building our communities, and it will be led by us, it will be sustained by us, and it will be in our lens, and it's up to us to do that.
You can't change structures. We can't stop prosecuting people for criminalized poverty if we are not in those positions to do it.
We want systemic structural change. You do need the state for that. You do need policy changes.
Community-led city and government support.
A really important theme that's emerged from this meeting is the central importance of community. There's tremendous capacity and expertise around the project of healing that exists within communities.
We were just kids, but the village failed to raise us. Instead of pouring love into us, they just threw us into cages. Justice is evidence of redemption made real.
The way we reimagine justice is through the lens of healing. Healing individuals that have been adversely impacted and or harmed. Healing environments that have experienced the greatest incidences of harm. Healing those that allegedly perpetrate harm. And also looking at state actors that cause harm.
Reimagining justice is about not seeing one incident as just that incident. You have to look at all of the sort of systemic, historical factors, all the things that preceded the violent act. If we can get to the place where we're realistically addressing some of those, we might actually be able to cut into these incidents of violence.
I'm the mother of a murdered son. I've lived a life of physical, emotional, psychological turmoil, trauma. We cannot heal what we are not willing to confront.
Justice will be served when we honor the truth.
We need to be brave enough to fundamentally remake our system. It's going to take some radical freedom dreaming to get us to where we need to be.
This is just the beginning of a really important conversation that we need to have as a society.
I feel energized by the fact that we do have some really powerful community members and leaders who are already doing the work on the ground, but very cognizant of the bridge building that needs to happen between the state and community in order to get to real sustainable policy solutions.
Everybody hurts. Hold on.
Everybody hurts. Hold on.
So I participated in this roundtable discussion about 6 months ago, and I don't know whether it directly addresses your question. Jose, are you talking about violent protests and violent marches or injustices that are violent?
You know, the people like Fred was talking about, the Nazis, I call it the white tribalism.
Okay.
You know, people, in some ways, you want to expand the definition of social movement to include those lone wolf people that are acting in, like, without
talk
knowing each
about
other.
that, yeah.
They're acting in some sort of concert because they
Yes.
believe the same thing, that their white tribe is being invaded by, you know, people that don't belong here.
Mm-hmm.
Or on the left, the Weather Underground planned the bombing at Wayne State and police headquarters downtown. In Old Maine, they sat in a classroom and planned it, and evidently the bomb just didn't go off. But that kind of violence also in the revolutionary perspective.
So I talk about that in my class. You're talking about lone wolf radicals, militant radicals, opportunistic radicals. There are several definitions in which we talk about and classify these radicals as it relates to social movements. And you are correct. They are paramount when it comes to social movements. I didn't choose to talk about that. Matter of fact, we just talked about that in our class during our second or third week, Farrah. So I do cover that in my class.
Yeah, and they're united by social media.
Absolutely.
You know, this propaganda that keeps getting, you know, just passed on and reinforced.
Oh, that's even before social media, for sure. I mean, media in general. And we talk about those master frames. We talk about frame alignments on how this is getting, how the word is being spread, how they are, how membership, you know, is attained as it relates to those counter, I don't know whether we call them counter movements, but I do discuss that in my class. And I'm glad you brought it up, because that gave me an opportunity. I have a couple of students in here from the road, really 3. We go into great detail, and they have to identify those specific radicals, whether they're coordinated, lone, militant, as it relates to social movements. Those are key theories. So thank you. So as I close and as I wrap up, so I want to just kind of show you some pictures of my family. Kelly and I were talking earlier, and I, you know, had been meaning to ask Kelly, who works for Dr. Edwards, when I first met her, and I noticed her last name, and I didn't say anything, and I'm like, well, maybe I better not ask anything, but I asked it, you know, today. I'm like, Kennedy, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kennedy. I asked Kennedy today, I said, I've been wanting to ask you that your last name is Cockrell, and are you related to the Cockrell family? And she says, yes. And I particularly asked her, you know, who her dad was, and we kind of talked about that, and we talked about her grandfather, Kid Cockrell. And I told Kennedy, I'm like, wow. I said, we come from some strong social justice roots as it relates to our families. And my grandmother, who was in this picture standing next to the late Congresswoman Barbara Jordan, they were friends. So my grandmother was socially involved from a faith-based standpoint, politically, on a local level with your granddad, all the time. So I was kind of birthed in this. So my experiences as a kid growing up, you know, I kind of knew it. I didn't understand it. I'm a product of the 60s and the 70s, but knew that my family had the social justice activism capacity. And you all saw Mayor Coleman Young as well. And a lot of these people came to our homes. I mean, they just coalesced in our families. They weren't famous to me. So that's my grandmother. She was a huge fundraiser for the NAACP back in the days of the NAACP. She raised several dollars. As you can see, her name was Barbara. I was named after my grandmother. It's my dad's mother. And one of the quotes that, I kind of highlighted, this is from an old clipping of the Michigan Chronicle, and I actually have a huge legacy book of where I come from as it relates to social justice. My grandmother was a huge fundraiser. She could go out and get money. She knew how to ask for it, but she did not raise money for anything that she did not believe in as it related to her social consciousness. And one of the things that she would do, sell, thousands of dollars to the NAACP Fight for Freedom Fund dinner. I believe they were probably $50 back then. I think they were like $200 a plate, maybe more now. I'm not sure. I haven't been to a Freedom Fund dinner in a while. But she would always say, freedom ain't free. Freedom is not free. You got to pay for it. You have to pay for it. And then there's another picture with her with Ebony and Jet publisher, the late John H. Johnson. And then, her with Mrs. Coretta Scott King at different functions in Detroit, over at the house. It was my grandmother with Ozzie Davis and Rosa Parks and Mary Young in the back at different events. And I was always at these events. I knew who they were, but I was interested, but I wasn't interested. I was, a little kid. And it was just normal in my life. And then, that's me and my grandparents. And I'm on where the arrow is. And I had big hair then, I have big hair now. So teaching this class is very, not just intellectually or academically important to me, it's in my DNA. I lived it. I'm still learning, because these terms are emerging. If it's a new social justice term that I have to know, I gotta learn it. I gotta learn it quick, fast, and in a hurry, because if I say something as it relates to, let's just give an example with the LGBTQ, cisgender, different binaries. These terms are ever evolving, and these social movement justice terms have evolved over the last 40 years. So we have all kind of generational capacities in this room, and we all come from our different lenses now, but the ones that are sitting in this room that are activists, that are organizers, that are mobilizers, you did it in your youth. You started off as a student activist in social justice and in social justice movements. And we must continue to educate our future generations. And I'm looking so hard at the generations, just 5 generations out. And it's pretty disturbing. So I hope that you all gotten out of this lecture something that you can take away or research, or that you're curious about, or that you have more questions. And I love questions. I love the curiosity when I'm being asked these questions, or just having these discussions and dialogues, and you all pointing out and learning, me learning from you as well. So I thank you for your time. I thank you for your attentiveness, and peace.
Are there any other questions for Barbara?
I think we took a lot of them during this talk too.
There's one over there.
Okay.
I have an observation. Well, first, thank you so much. I have learned a lot. So this has completely expanded my vision of this area. I think it's pretty cool. I hope you can publish some of that, hopefully. I mean, it's very informative, and there is a lot of new categories and ways to connect the dots among all these theories of social movements. So I have an observation rather than a question. I have noticed a lot of parallels with the non-profit organizations, kind of like more formal organizations, and it's interesting, for instance, the sources of decline, the 4 sources of decline that you talked about for the social movements are identical to the sources of decline for non-profit organizations. So I guess I can ask a question in relation to that. So in learning and teaching about that, have you come across studies produced by scholars of formal non-profit organizations, or that talk about how and under what conditions some of the social movements actually formalize fully and register and become non-profit organizations? So when is it more likely to happen as opposed to bureaucratizing and then kind of dissolving?
That's a great question. And the first thing that comes to my head as it relates to non-profit organization is education. The issues of education. Let's talk about, when you say non-profits, are we talking about foundations?
I'm talking about 501c3s.
Okay.
So foundations can be part of it, but probably not. So in other words, like let's say we had civil rights movement. Is it likely, well, in case of civil rights movement, that's not the case, that is it likely that any other social movement will decide to register as 501c3 to formalize and to basically become a more or less permanent organization?
Yes.
Like the NAACP.
Like the NAACP, the Detroit Justice Center.
So what determines that? So is it like other factors that make it more likely that it will fully formalize, or?
The particular injustice that communities face, okay? So let's talk about Detroit, for example. The level of poverty, the level of education, these are all, well, these two are really high on the injustice list, and you have housing, water. I mean, you have several nonprofits that have formalized, that are right up the street at St. Peter's Episcopal. Monica Lewis Patrick, We the People, who specifically organize and formalize social movements around water shutoffs. Flint alone have developed nonprofits, from the celebrities, from Jaden Smith, who has a water station in Flint, to several grassroots organizations that do formalize. And it's broken down: housing, poverty, education, violence, all forms of violence, sexual violence. The Me Too movement. I mean, the Me Too movement was started and originated by a black woman that focused on sexual violence against indigenous and women of color. She started her nonprofit based off of that over 10 years ago. So I can name a lot historically. Not a lot historically. I need some of my historians, to help me on the whole nonprofit question that you're asking. I mean, Dr. Pearson pointed out the NAACP, and we see how that has, they're still around. They have not declined, but their membership is really down. And a lot of their things have changed, at least in the Detroit chapter. Nationally, yes. I mean, a lot of, folks.
You can tell by the name how sort of dated it is in that organization, but it still keeps,
It's still here. It's still surviving. Yeah, and
So is
the
a follow-up
leaders.
question: is there like a stigmatization or like a negative attitude among those who are in social movements about the nonprofits? Because I mean, it's a different form. One is like highly driven and enthusiastic and informal. The other one is basically a formal organization that has its structure, has to report to IRS. So it's much more connected to the state as opposed to a social movement. I'm just curious how people in social movements perceive those formal organizations.
From the people that belong to them?
You can't go against the system once you're in the system.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Yeah.
And some people are very quiet about who they align with as it relates to social movement. Some things I kind of keep quiet about because, you know, that perception, that's a conflict. These natural, conflict, natural expressions of real or perceived issues. And some people won't. You know, I mean, Black Lives Matter, come on. I'm sorry I have to keep talking about Black Lives Matter, but there's so many examples within that social movement as it relates to money. Several organizers and activists who created Black Lives Matter are even dead. I mean, we're talking about young people that have been killed. So I look at the violence, aspect when you're associated, with one. It just depends. I wish I could just narrow down, that, and maybe what we probably need to do is focus on a few, and I can put you in touch with, a few that can kind of have that conversation with you as it relates to the nonprofit, the business model, because they have to be self-sustaining in order to be able to help the people who are marginalized.
That would be a good research study to compare the non-social justice nonprofits with the social justice nonprofits and see where they differ in this conversation.
And how they perceive each other, right? Because I mean, if you institutionalize and you start taking foundation or governmental funding, then you're no longer perceived as an adversary to the state,
Absolutely.
right? So your function changes, but you have to do it to sustain. So that's interesting, yeah.
So we can find some funding. Dr. Pearson, made a great suggestion. Maybe he'll help us research and give us a little bit of funding to study that. Again, thank you all for your time. For my students who show up, Kennedy, Farah, anybody else from social justice activism? PCS 2010, 2830, PS special, okay. So I only have 2. So you go off and get your extra credit. Okay, thank you for coming. I'm glad that's over. Surviving. Oh, thank you.
This is a brown caddy and this is a black caddy.
Oh, you come bearing gifts too? I got options? Excuse me. Oh, this is very,
This is black and this one.
So was it how different shoes?
so much more colors. Since I'm wearing black today, I'm gonna go with this. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Can I give you a hug? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's all right. You can also take my picture.
Okay,
Take
awesome.
picture.
Let me take my glasses off.
Well, on the side, water was there. That was like.
Thank you.
And you were not nervous at all. You came out swinging. And kept swinging.
I do that too much. That's what activists do. We have to.